His academic experience focuses on language in relation to urban multilingualism, youth, popular cultures, ethnicities, class education, research methodology, and more recently, in securitization. This orientation is present not only in his seminal 2006 publication, Language in Late Modernity, Interaction in an Urban School, but also in many other cutting-edge publications, among which Crossing Language and Ethnicity Among Adolescents. Besides having been the editorial board of several international journals, he is the editor of working papers in urban language and literacies. For his contribution to the field of language studies, he has been awarded many prizes and academic distinctions. I was going to add a lot of superlatives, but he has asked me not to do so. But I have to say that o Ben é querido, gente. Ele é o cara, okay? And so it is with great honor that we have such a distinguished scholar for today's plenary session to talk about language, insecurity, and everyday practice. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ben Rampton.
Well, thank you. The honor and the pleasure is mine. It's also been a really kind of extremely stimulating conference, and also challenging in terms of positionality. But for the time being, at least, there's not much I can do to change what I'm going to say, and I'm going to talk about language and security, focusing on language and discourse in times and places where people are talking about enemies and threats to their existence, their very existence. Now, this is a fairly new theme for me, and it's a topic that's really too serious to dabble in casually without some defensible justification. So I'd like to say right at the start, and this might initially sound paradoxical, I'm coming to questions of security and insecurity very much as an ethnographic and interactional sociolinguist. Throughout the paper, I'll be working with a view of sociolinguistics that I associate with founding figures like Gumpertz, Hymes, Ox, Heath, Leboeuf, as well as lots of contemporary research in linguistic ethnography, linguistic anthropology. So in the definition that I'm orienting to, I'm going to call sociolinguistics the study of everyday communication in changing social conditions. Now, I'll start my presentation with a glimpse of changing ethnopolitical relations in Britain, and then I'll introduce the notion of securitization, also reflecting on enemy as a social category. In fact, both these notions put the everyday in jeopardy. And if that's the case, is there still a place for sociolinguistics as a study of everyday communication? And if there is a place, then what is it? To pursue these questions, I'll first talk about the classroom research I've been doing on Greek Cypriots learning Turkish, the language of the enemy. And then I'll broaden the discussion to peace and conflict and security studies. And I'll argue that Goffman's work on interactional insecurity has a lot to contribute to growing interest in how the big issues addressed in international relations as a field of study are actually lived out in everyday practice. But let's start with the dynamics of ethnicity in Britain and the kind of understanding generated in linguistic ethnography. 30 years ago, when I studied everyday communicative practice in a multi-ethnic neighborhood in the South Midlands of England in the 1980s, race and anti-racism were very high on the national political agenda. Young people with family links to the Caribbean were generally regarded as deviant problems that needed policing, and people with South Asian backgrounds were likely to be seen as the victims of linguistic and cultural difference and incompetence that needed help. These images circulated in the media, in public discourse, in education policy, and they also showed up in my recordings of the recreational interaction of white, black, and Asian adolescents. So when youngsters shifted into Jamaican accents, the stances they projected tended to be assertive, verbally resourceful, aligned with youth culture, opposed to authority. And in contrast, shifts to accented Indian English projected deferential cultural and linguistic incompetence. At the same time, it was clear that when kids altered their speech like this, they were manipulating ideological representations in lots of different ways, seriously, playfully, with and without conviction. In fact, the key thing was the shared local sensibility that they constructed in all this crossing and stylization, very much transgressing the lines of ethnic descent essentialized in multicultural discourses of the time. And this led to a kind of more general political methodological point. Yes, generalizations about contemporary ethnicity, class, gender, and so forth are really important, both in analysis and politics. But in the process of abstracting and simplifying, it's vital to keep going back to the kinds of everyday practice you can capture in ethnographic recordings. Without that anchoring, without a sense of how, in one way or another, people often do manage in the generally rather low-key practices of day-to-day life, you're left vulnerable to the high-octane dramatizations of the dominant idiom, panicked and unable to imagine how anyone copes. Now let's move forward to the present, where political discourses about language and ethnicity have substantially changed. There's an excellent paper by Kamran Khan where he shows how a security agenda has come to dominate legislation and political discourse about citizenship and the testing and teaching of English for speakers of other languages. After 9/11 and the riots in 2001, a discourse has emerged that sees institutional racism as less significant than the threat of Muslim disorder terrorism. Muslims are seen as a suspect community. Language proficiency and terrorism are lumped together by senior British politicians, and all the public services are made partners in the counter-terrorist PREVENT program. So you can see the signs of this everywhere. Now, this certainly doesn't go unchallenged, but even so, says Khan, security is now a multifaceted and omnipervasive dynamic in contemporary life, meriting much more extensive critical attention than sociolinguists have so far given it. And one reason for taking a closer look goes back to the point I made a minute ago. Sociolinguistic ethnography can help to get to processes you hear about in the political and media arena, can help to get the processes you hear in the political arena into perspective, quite often cutting the ground away from dominant accounts, pointing in new and different directions. But there is a complication if we want to talk about everyday practice and everyday social relations in the kind of context that Kamran talks about. In the securitization processes that he describes, the everyday is itself thrown into question. And this forces us to ask whether sociolinguistics as the study of everyday communication is still viable in contexts like this. So let's take a closer look at this notion of securitization. Now, in the study of international relations, of IR, the idea of securitization was first developed to describe institutional processes in which influential figures identify threats to the very existence of the state and then they seek to suspend normal political rights and procedures. With securitization, a particular group is said to present such a major risk, such an existential threat, that it needs to be moved out of the realm of ordinary politics into the realm of exceptional measures. In other words, the rules, freedoms, and entitlements that tend to underpin our sense of the everyday are said to be in danger, either from the threat itself or the measures developed to thwart it. Now let's expand on this by thinking a bit more about a very closely linked notion, the notion of enemy, which hasn't been really very prominent in Anglophone sociolinguistics. Yes, in this sociolinguistics, there's lots of work on conflict and struggle, but for the most part, in the sociolinguistics I know, this happens inside nation states, and it's more about domination and subordination, competition, rivalry, and politics, much more than actual war with violence and fatalities. Likewise, yes, the other with a capital O, is a very big feature in sociolinguistic analysis, but on the whole, this stops quite a long way short of enemy. Identity has been a central sociolinguistic theme for the last 30 years, and the contrasting other is crucial in identity definition. In fact, there's a plurality of others around us, others identified in terms of taste, style, wealth, age, expertise, gender, race, and so forth. And it's the salience and significance of particular others that gives us our identity as individuals and members of particular social groups. Even so, the figure of the enemy is different from the types of other that sociolinguists usually analyzed. In liberal democracies, there's cooperation between others. There's cooperation between people occupying different, even opposite categories, and some of the cooperation's intimate and long-term. In contrast, actual or potential enemies should be kept out, defeated or destroyed. Enemies are usually embedded in substantial social systems of their own, and if they're an imminent threat, then in the societies they're threatening, people are supposed to sink their differences in the interests of united self-defense. Typically, interaction with an enemy is either forbidden or it's associated with well-organized violence, and the moral and legal codes governing interaction between fellow citizens don't apply. Plus, of course, enemy links into a range of other institutional categories, practices, and processes that we tend to neglect in the sociolinguistics of everyday communication. Now, this is all quite dramatic, but we shouldn't necessarily let it disorient us. Yes, if we're talking about killing, incarceration, and expulsion, the idea of the everyday itself starts to sound precarious, and right away you instinctively want to relativize it, calling it peacetime activity. But let's not forget that the IR scholars who first started talking about securitization in the 1990s described securitization as a speech act. They'd been reading Austin and Searle. And if we think about enemy as an identity, then there are obviously very sophisticated frameworks in sociolinguistics for understanding how identities are generated, circulated, claimed, attributed, relinquished, resisted, and so forth. But we do need to be careful. The topic's too serious to be treated as a space for the free play of our disciplinary imaginations. So in the next section, I'd like to go back to being empirical, and this time I'll focus on Cyprus, where I've been doing some work with Konstantina Charalambos and Paniota Charalambos. If we can start to untangle some of the relationships between enemies, conflict, language, and everyday practice in this particular site, maybe we can come up with some theoretical insights that are potentially transportable to other settings elsewhere. In Cyprus, interethnic tension between Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, and in the 1960s and 70s, it intensified into violent conflict and war, culminating in the partition of the island in 1974. Since the partition, there hasn't been much violent confrontation, but in the Greek Cypriot part of Cyprus, where our research has been based, hostile images of Turks and Turkish Cypriots have been perpetuated in the media and the mainstream education. The fighting has stopped, but there's still a great deal of intercommunal hostility. But in 2003, Cyprus joined the European Union, and there was a lot of emphasis on finding a political settlement to the Cyprus conflict. As part of this, the Greek Cypriot government announced that it was going to set up voluntary language classes for Greek Cypriots who wanted to learn Turkish, both in secondary schools and adult institutes. All this fitted with a rhetoric of reconciliation, and the new classes were presented as an emblem of goodwill. Indeed, if we go back to the literature on international relations, these developments look like de-securitization. They look like efforts to stop treating people on the other side as enemies, efforts to start to bring them back into ordinary civic and political life, loosening some of the special measures devised to contain an existential threat. So Konstantina Panyotra and I looked at how these developments were affecting education, and we carried out a couple of linguistic ethnographies. The picture that emerged was mixed, and overall, learning the language of the former enemy seemed to be a bit more straightforward for adults. Even so, it was clear that, okay, the Greek Cypriot government presented these classes as a gesture of goodwill, but this did not coincide with any big change, either in public discourse or in the secondary curriculum. So for the Greek Cypriots who were teaching and learning the language, there were a lot of complications. In interview, for example, Greek Cypriot learners of Turkish often told us that they were called traitors, Turks, or Turkophiles by their peers, friends, occasionally by members of their own families. As a result, they initially hid their textbooks, they avoided mentioning the classes that they taught or attended, and they developed elaborate justifications in defense. In fact, in more than half of the secondary school interviews, students said there were good security reasons for knowing the language of the enemy. Some of these interviewees referred to war in the future, and others said they'd be able to detect if they were being insulted, and they'd be able to swear back. Now, in language teaching theory, it's often said that classes benefit from the introduction of everyday material from the real world of the target language. But as one of these teachers explained, how am I going to practice dialogues in the classroom between salesmen and buyers when the students aren't supposed to cross to the other side and buy things from the occupied territories? Yes, there certainly were students who were interested in closer links with Turkish Cypriots, especially among adults, but there were also a lot who told us that even though they had chosen to study Turkish, they didn't want any relations with Turkish speakers. I don't like them, I don't want them, I wish they were effaced, may they all die. Now, these really are rather extreme statements, and it's hard to make any sense of what's going on here initially. Okay, the government's reasons for setting up these classes seem to make sense, backed up by a lot of work on language and intercultural understanding, but with the intense hostility expressed by these students, maybe we really are moving into an exceptional space where everyday norms cease to hold sway, where enemy takes over as a central identity, and where potentially the sociolinguistic vocabularies developed in conditions of peace and stability cease to function. Alternatively, this is precisely the kind of situation where broad brush characterizations need to be interrogated with linguistic ethnography, and that's obviously the approach that we took in our project. So let's see whether we can actually make sense of these classes. Now, to understand these language classes, the first thing we need to do is to complicate the notion of the everyday. And here, the distinction between ideology and practice becomes really important. So on the one hand, we've got the ideological representation of specific everyday worlds, representations that come in different shapes in different times and places. In the language teaching textbooks and exercises, these representations are often stylized textual representations of the world of the target language speaker. And as I've said, a lot of Greek Cypriot learners of Turkish were seriously alarmed by the idea of routine interaction with Turkish speakers. But at the same time, if we turn from ideology to practice, there's the everyday of the habitual activities that people actually participate in on a daily basis, the situated social practices that they experience at first hand. Now, of course, these practices are permeated and influenced by ideological representations. But this is an everyday that's lived rather than just represented, and it's much more complicated, open, and indeterminate than ideology on its own. It's this second everyday that linguistic ethnographers and interactional sociolinguists try to describe. And if we focus on this, we can start to see that even though teaching and learning the language of the enemy might be different from what we usually see in conditions of peace and stability, it's not incomprehensibly different. It's not a different planet. So, first of all, let's think about the institutional sites where secondary students encountered Turkish and how this could make a contribution to the acceptability of learning Turkish. In actual fact, Turkish is constitutionally recognized as a national language throughout Cyprus. But Turkish wasn't given a special position at school, and it wasn't compulsory in these Greek Cypriot schools. Instead, it was made available as an option in the foreign language curriculum. And there's a case for saying that the humdrum institutional ordinariness of foreign language teaching was itself significant. Curricular foreign language learning is an unspectacular but long-term and widely established activity, and with all the administrative and delivery structures already in place, the government could slot Turkish into the system by adding it as just another language to the list. They could add it just as another language to the list of foreign language options. But once it had appeared in the annual booklet of modern foreign language options, this could then be a first cue for students to talk to their parents about whether or not Turkish could play a part in their future, even if this future only stretched as far as the end of year exams. After that, if students did select Turkish, then once or twice a week, these students would find themselves participating in a space where objects and practices linked with Turkish had a routine presence close at hand. And they'd also need to work out how to justify their choice to others. And more than that, small tokens of Turkishness would begin to circulate through the low-key everyday activities of secondary study, traveling back and forwards between school and home in homework bags, getting mentioned in chat about tests and exams. The issue of Greek Cypriot relations might still be very controversial, but the mundane routines of school foreign language learning could help to dull some of the emotion that Turkish stimulated. Now, of course, all that presupposes that the classroom experience of learning Turkish wasn't traumatically riven by conflict. Well, it wasn't. And this in turn raises the question, how did Greek Cypriot teachers of Turkish actually cope, facing a lot of potentially very hostile students? Well, we identified 3 pedagogic strategies. But in the one which was easily the most common, teachers depoliticized the learning of Turkish by decontextualizing the language, disconnecting it from Turkish people, from Turkish culture, and all its political and emotional associations. Instead, they presented the language as a neutral lexicogrammatical code, and they avoided any talk about the Turks or Cypriot politics in the classroom. Now, of course, there's a long tradition of teaching which treats language as a formal code. But all of these teachers were very well aware that they were presenting a very narrow view of Turkish. They said that they were doing this deliberately because of the ideological controversy around Turkish. Yes, of course, that jars with the orthodoxies of communicative language teaching, but as I've said, the idea of authentic contexts for learning and using Turkish was simply too much for a lot of these students. And if teachers tried it, they were worried about losing their jobs. So rather than seeing the suppression of culture in these classes as a sign of these teachers' narrow traditionalism, there's a good case for seeing this as acute cultural sensitivity. Looking beyond the kind of institutional presence that Turkish had and the teaching strategies that teachers employed, what about the opportunity for learning? What kinds of opportunity for learning did these lessons present? Now, as I've already hinted, in the adult classes, a lot of people were learning Turkish to facilitate greater interaction with Turkish speakers, enhancing the contacts that quite a lot of them already had. But for the adolescents, the lessons seemed more like a kind of tentative and precarious prelude to the kind of commitment that Turkish involved for adults. Rather than crossing the threshold, they were assembling on the porch, prevaricating in the antechamber. Turkish was there on the table, but they hadn't necessarily signed up to go any further. Students who abhorred the idea of contact with a Turkish speaker said that they were only doing it because they needed the language for matriculation and they'd been told that it was an easy subject. For students like that, even a shift from hostility to tolerance would be a step forward. And even with interviewees who were quite positive about the language, the idea of getting closer to to Turkish speakers was regularly hedged with phrases like, so far but no further, only up to that point, but that's about it, implying that's all, don't think there's much more than that. As a result, our data is overflowing with the kind of cautious, watchful, qualified activity, and metaphorically, it looks more like throat clearing than talk itself. More like a kind of long, deep in-breath than an actual speaking turn. Now, I'm not sure how well these processes would show up in the conventional metrics of success in a foreign language, which generally only start to notice and measure progress when somebody starts to speak the language a bit, or takes an interest in the culture. But for interactional sociolinguistics, none of this is a problem. In-breaths, asides, speaking in disguise are all central sociolinguistic concerns. And I think that the notion of language crossing can help make some sense of these lessons. And to explain, let me just recap on three key features of crossing, going back to the account that I developed in the 1990s. First, let's go back to my my original definition. Crossing is the use of a language or variety that feels anomalously other for the participants in an activity, and it involves movement across quite sharply sensed social or ethnic boundaries in ways that can raise questions of legitimacy. Now, I stress that because the legitimacy issue that's central to crossing quite often gets lost when crossing is seen as just another kind of post-structuralist term for vernacular multilingualism. Second, detailed interactional analyses have shown that crossing occurs in moments and activities where the ordinary common sense world is problematized or partly suspended. So in my 1995 book, for example, there was lots of crossing in games, where scholars often say there's an agreed relaxation of the constraints governing routine interaction. Taking this one step further, the fact that crossing so often coincided with these interruptions to the normal interactional reproduction of social reality, there was an important implication. When youngsters crossed into a language that belonged to an ethnic outgroup, they destabilized ethnic boundaries, ethnic fixity, and ethnic division. But if they were doing it in one of these specially licensed moments, you'd know that they weren't really claiming to be members of the outgroup they were evoking, and you could let them get away with it. Third, there was actually a lot of variation in the scale of the moments and occasions when when everyday norms were relaxed and crossing was possible. Yes, crossing happened in games, but it also occurred in more elaborate staged performances with songs and impersonations. It occurred in jocular language teaching routines, and most fleetingly, it occurred in the small-scale interpersonal verbal rituals that Goffman describes as moments of heightened interactional uncertainty, meeting new people at the start of an encounter close to a breach of etiquette. Now, if we apply these three aspects of crossing to Greek Cypriots learning Turkish at the secondary school, first, and most obviously, we can say that engaging with Turkish obviously raised huge questions of legitimacy. And yes, we seem to be dealing with crossing in some form or other. You couldn't capture what was going on with concepts like stylization or polylingualism. But second, if we're looking at the scale and institutionalization of the processes that facilitated crossing, Greek Cypriots learning Turkish looked a bit different from white or Asian people in London or Copenhagen using Jamaican or Turkish. In most of the urban sociolinguistic literature, crossing gets its impetus from the experience of people with different ethnic backgrounds living in the same area, attending the same schools or workplaces. Crossing often challenges the racist discourses that seek to divide these people, and it's in popular culture and the mass and social media that crossing finds its most public platforms. The situation in the Republic of Cyprus was very, very different. The social divisions at issue in the Turkish language classroom were rooted in war and armed violence. And rather than emerging from everyday cohabitation, crossing in Cyprus got its impetus from the EU's insistence on a solution to the intractable Cyprus problem. And far from being exclusively based in non-standard popular culture, Turkish was officially promoted in state education as an established and regular part of the curriculum. Finally, what about the suspension of everyday reality that is so common in crossing and that Goffman calls keying? Okay? Goffman identifies several basic types of keying. There's make-believe, which we can line up with performance art. There's contests, which covers games. And there's what Goffman calls ceremonials, which can cover interaction rituals. But if we turn to the Turkish lessons, we see a fourth type of keying in question, what Goffman calls technical redoing. For Goffman, technical redoings are activities like exhibitions, rehearsals, and pedagogic demonstrations. They are, 1, performed out of their usual context, 2, for utilitarian purposes, openly different from those of the original performance, 3, the understanding being that the original outcome of the activity will not occur. The effect is to give the neophyte experience in performing under conditions in which it is felt no actual engagement with the world is allowed. This fits the language lessons rather well. Turkish was extracted from its sociocultural context. It was promoted as a conveniently easy subject that would help you pass your secondary matriculation, not as something you'd use to communicate. And it was fine for students who never wanted to talk to Turkish speaker. Purely technical classroom exercises certainly weren't the only interactional site for safe crossing into Turkish. But even so, technical redoing seemed to be much the most widely practiced key for Turkish language crossing. Now, I began this discussion of Greek Cypriots learning Turkish by asking whether the ethnographic sociolinguistics of everyday practice was capable of dealing with situations where notions like enemy are dominant and particular groups are deemed so necessary that they're placed in special measures beyond the realms of everyday contact. And I asked, if we applied sociolinguistic concepts to the dynamics of intense hostility, would they prove trivializing? Would they be inept? Or could they be illuminating, once again pointing to intricacies and openings unimagined in the simplifying generalizations you get in politics, the media, and research interviews as well? Overall, I think sociolinguistics comes out quite well. Despite the intense difficulties that Greek Cypriot students faced, we've identified a range of recognizable structures and practices that sustain the students in the controversial activities associated with learning the language of the enemy. At the same time, our analysis identified ways in which the legacy of violent conflict produced styles of teaching and learning that wouldn't really be appreciated in the normative discourses of communicative language teaching, and we identified a type of crossing that's rather new for the sociolinguistics literature. Admittedly, you could argue that all this has been rather an easy test. After all, the situation in Cyprus has been described as a comfortable conflict, and we were mostly only dealing with representations of the enemy, not meetings with the enemy face to face. Well, that's true, and I'm certainly not suggesting that linguistic ethnography is the only kind of linguistics relevant in conflict trouble situations. But even though the situation in Cyprus might not be really acute, you can see similar language learning dynamics in other settings affected by existential insecurity. And in addition, research in international relations on security, peace, and conflict generally covers a whole range of different conflicts. And in IR, there's actually growing interest in the kinds of illumination that ethnographic sociolinguistics can provide. Let's now turn to this. Historically, and for the most part, still today, IR research focuses on very large-scale processes, the relationships between sovereign states governing particular populations in specific territories. But as I've already mentioned, in the 1990s, when researchers started talking about securitization, they used speech act theory from Austin and Searle. And since then, more elaborate and empirical theories of communication have been introduced. Overall, there's a commitment here to challenging the sweeping abstractions of mainstream IR that's rather similar to the ethnographic impulse I mentioned at the start of my talk. Admittedly, the interest in IR, in ethnography and sociolinguistics is still rather programmatic, but there's a lot of scope for dialogue. And I think sociolinguistics has a lot to learn in return. For example, if you think of linguistic landscape research, where are the CCTV cameras? We've started to address this complementarity in our complementarity between sociolinguistics and IR in our Cyprus research. And researchers working on post-conflict peace building have already shown some interest. But rather than just laying out some frameworks that these ideas, that these IR scholars can choose from and pick as they will, I'd like to point to a potentially deeper affinity between sociolinguistics and studies of security, an affinity based in Irving Goffman. In the IR work that I've been referring to, a number of terms seem to recur again and again: security, insecurity, existential threat, states of exception, surveillance. Well, these concepts are foundational for Goffman as well. In IR discussions of securitization, there is a central place for the distinction between normal, everyday socio-political relations and exceptional special measures. But just look at Goffman's first two books. The first was his 1959, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, but the second, just 2 years later, was Asylums. And this focused on total institutions where people are cut off from everyday life, often because they're deemed to be a threat to the community. The proximity of these two books is no accident. And throughout Goffman's career, there was a constant interest in the tension between the ordinary and the exceptionalized, not just in institutions, but also in face-to-face interaction. So to begin with, Asylums focuses on walled institutions set aside to contain threats to the community. But in later work, Goffman focuses on continual threats to the self that individuals have to deal with in interpersonal encounters. When individuals come into one another's immediate presence, he says, territories of the self bring to the scene a vast filigree of wires that individuals are uniquely equipped to trip over. When a person volunteers a statement or a message, however trivial or commonplace, they place everyone present in jeopardy. Managing these incessant threats to mutual respect, individuals develop a defensive orientation towards saving their own face and a protective orientation towards saving the face of others. We can see the same shift of scale from the institutional to the interactional if we look at forms of control. In Asylum, Goffman talks about spaces in the mental hospital where inmates know that they're being surveilled. But then, when he looks at how people configure their bodies to participate in everyday talk together, he brings in bystanders and eavesdroppers as non-ratified participants, using the term collusive side play for what happens when two bystanders surreptitiously editorialize on what they're overhearing, exactly as happens in the NSA and GCHQ. Turning to the efforts that people make to evade the restrictive institutional regimes they inhabit, Asylum talks about escape worlds in sports, theatrical productions, games, and so forth, where inmates temporarily blot out all sense of the environment which they must abide. But when Goffman talks about keying in his 1974 frame analysis, he also shows that the everyday realities governing our lives can be temporarily suspended within the small-scale practices of face-to-face interaction, as we saw in my discussion of crossing earlier on. There's more we could say about Goffman's deep and enduring preoccupation with insecurity in everyday life. But let's bring IR and security studies back into the picture, pointing to three ways in which Goffman both expands and thickens their account, even in the most influential studies of everyday IR. First, Goffman emphatically contradicts a worry that you'll lose touch with the political if you turn to securitization in the everyday. So according to Jeff Heismans, who's one of the leading scholars of everyday IR, political critiques of securitization have focused on high-profile declarations, government ministers speaking about threats to society. Now, there's a big risk, says Heismans, that this kind of analysis won't be possible anymore because securitization is becoming more diffuse, permeating the everyday through digital surveillance, routine bureaucratic procedures, CCTV cameras, and so forth. Well, it's certainly true that with algorithms and digital profiling, lots of security screening goes on behind our backs. But more generally, Goffman shows us that everyday interaction is absolutely teeming with the processes thematized in macroscopic security studies: threats of exclusion, suspicion, deception, avoidance, and preventative action. Second, Goffman contradicts the idea that everyday self-preservation strategies only operate among ordinary, everyday people. You can see this, for example, in McGinty's highly influential work on everyday peace building. McGinty cites Goffman, he refers to avoidance and ritualized politeness, and he talks about the transformative potential of transgressive acts. But at the same time, he says there's a big difference between bottom-up and top-down approaches to peace. So on the one hand, there are the everyday civilities produced by people, local people directly affected by conflict. And on the other, he says, there are the expert peace-building discourses of expatriates, which are standardized and professionalized through best practice and lessons learned. But that top-down, bottom-up contrast is much too sharply drawn, and you can't conflate a person's communicative sensibilities with the scripts and communication rule books provided by their institutional bosses. Okay. Yes, okay, in asylums, Goffman describes survival strategies in a subordinated group, the inmates, but he then extends these survival frameworks to interaction generally. So we should also expect to find intricate facework, collusions, and keyings populating interaction in the seats of power as well. Now, under Foucault's influence, quite a lot of IR scholars now reject what they call realist ideas about the objective factuality of the state, the objective factuality of security, borders, etc. And instead, there's growing interest in how these political concepts, like the state and so forth, are produced in practical activity, involving a plethora of different people, processes, types of knowledge, technologies, actions, and arguments. There's a quote on the slide about this, and of course, the key point is that it increases the relevance of ethnographic sociolinguistics in general, and Goffman in particular. As Borba demonstrates in vivid empirical detail, Foucault and Goffman are actually very complementary. And you can see this when Foucault says that we shouldn't be too quick to identify contemporary power struggles with particular political causes or interests. In these contemporary power struggles, says Foucault, in such struggles, people criticize instances of power which are the closest to them. They do not necessarily look for the chief enemy, but for the immediate enemy. They may well refer to ethnicity, gender, class, race at a later stage, but in the first instance, these are struggles which, on the one hand, assert the right to be different, and on the other, attack everything which separates the individuals. The individual breaks the links with others. Translating this rather precisely into Goffman, you could say that Foucault's talking about defensive and protective facework struggles over the territories of the self. And of course, Goffman elaborates on all this in considerable detail. So all in all, if you are a political scientist following Foucault, you're likely to find that Goffman is quite a substantial theoretical and empirical resource. Okay, in this presentation, I've been exploring the relationship between sociolinguistics as the study of everyday communicative practice in changing social conditions on the one hand, and on the other, securitization, a process that speaks of enemies and exceptional threats to everyday existence. Does securitization invalidate sociolinguistics, or can sociolinguistics point to everyday complexities in securitization that would otherwise be missed? Well, to try to answer this, I looked at the case of Greek Cypriots learning Turkish, the language of the enemy. The idea of everyday contact with Turkish speakers was highly controversial ideologically, but the humdrum practice of institutional language learning made this possible. Turning to the kind of learning activity that the Turkish lessons involved, the notion of language crossing proved useful, even though the Cyprus conflict generated a type of crossing that hasn't really been documented in the urban sociolinguistics. Large-scale, institutionalized crossing with lots of technical redoing. After that, I picked up on Goffman as a leading theorist of interactional insecurity, and I suggested that Goffman had lots to offer IR researchers interested in the significance of geopolitical conflict for everyday practice. Now, there's undoubtedly lots more work to be done on the relationship between sociolinguistics and insecuritization. It's something we want to pursue in the Language Insecurity in Everyday Practice lab that we've set up at King's. But let me just finish with a cautionary thought on analytical positioning. My sense is that the securitization issues I've been discussing here today are going to become increasingly salient for sociolinguistics over the next few years. But if this happens, we should talk about sociolinguistics and security, not the sociolinguistics of security. With the latter, the sociolinguistics of security, there's the possibility of security-focused sociolinguistics getting separated off from ordinary sociolinguistics, when in fact it's precisely the relationship between the ordinary and the exceptionalized that we're interested in. We certainly don't want to trivialize the serious and potentially dangerous processes that securitization speaks of, and it's vital not to hold to the mundane blindly, missing practices and occasions when the reproduction of the social world gets seriously threatened or breached. But it's equally important not to err in the opposite direction, relinquishing our grasp of the everyday. Let's not forget that in securitization, the everyday is actually a major stake. If you're on the wrong side of an overzealous securitization process, you're being told, sorry, the everyday isn't for you. So it's important not to ratify or accelerate this exclusion by accepting securitization on its own terms, focusing only on what's been declared exceptional. Now, there's obviously lots to learn about managing this tricky line between the everyday and the exceptionalized. There's a lot to pick up from researchers in critical peace and conflict and security studies. And on the sociolinguistic side, maybe Goffman's as good a starting point as any, or at least that's what I proposed today, and we'll have to wait and see. Obrigado.